Welcome to Ancient Brews, a series where we look at ancient brewing techniques, brewing beers, ginger beers, meads, all the fermented beverages that were made back in the olden days, going back thousands of years. Beer recipes have been around for a great many hundreds of years, thousands of years, and we're going to have a look and sort of dig a few of those up and look at some of those techniques. If you go back even a while, it was hard to transport beer. You make a beer in a central location, you try and transport it. By the time you get to the local pub over some rough roads, you don't have beer anymore. IPAs came a long way to correct that, but most pubs brew their own. So we're going to have a look at some of those techniques. One of the reasons why a lot of the brewing was done rather than just drinking straight water was basically sterilising the water, boiling it, adding the yeast, help kill off the bacteria and whatnot, give you something that was reasonably safe to drink. So we're going to start the series off. We're going to brew a ginger beer, because a ginger beer is a really nice, easy one to do. I've already got some water warming up here. I'll just get that cranking up a little bit more. There it goes. So I've got the ingredients here. Now ginger root, which is a core piece. This is ginger powder, also known as race ginger. Would have been dried and crushed and powdered for transport. You can just pick up the ginger powder from your local store. And the sugars we're using today, we're using molasses and some brown sugar, and that's usually enough just to give it that hint. Too much molasses and the molasses flavour takes over, so I like to use a bit, about half and half. There's 240 mils of molasses and there's 230 mils of brown sugar there. So we'll mix them in later once we get this up and running, and we'll give it some lime. You can use lemon or lime, but I prefer lime because I think lime and ginger goes well together. It's not enough to flavour, but it just helps it give it that little bit more refreshing taste. And then we've got our yeast, which we'll get to in a bit too. Alright, so we'll start off by slicing up the ginger. Now, there's no real way to do this correctly or incorrectly. We're just going to chop it up into little pieces, as so. What you can't smell, which I can smell, is that wonderful smell of ginger. It is awesome. Mind you, if you don't like ginger, probably not so awesome, but don't worry. I'm probably going to do a mead next. I'm tossing up that, or maybe we might even look at doing an old Dutch beer recipe, which is using a star anise to give it that refreshing taste. So we've chopped these up a bit. Chopping, I said we don't need to be too worried because this is just going to be boiled, and then we're going to dispose of it once we've got all the gingery goodness out of it. Right. So put this into our mortar and pestle. And we're not going to really grind it up, we're just going to give it a good bashing. I just want to make sure I've broken up some of those fibrous strands a bit, just enough to get, just enough that we're going to get the flavour out of the ginger when we boil it, because that's the whole point here. I must admit, I do love the smell and taste of ginger, which is why I'm starting with a ginger beer. Also, as I said, it's a nice simple recipe. Prep time is really quite short, and most of these beers that we're going to be making, they don't have a huge shelf life. Crank that up a bit. I want to get that boiling because we're going to need to boil this in here for a while to get those flavours out of it. Right, I'm going to take a little bit of that water. I'll need a little bit of warm water to do for my yeast. I'm going to pinch a piece of that bit of that. Alright, so now we're going to put, that's just starting to come to the boil now. Hear that sizzling away. So I'm going to drop that in there. We're also going to put our race ginger or powdered ginger in there. Alright. We're going to put our sugar in there, which is at 230 grams, just under a quarter of a kilo. I think that rates to around half a pound. And we're going to put in the molasses, and I'm going to use most of this just because it says 240 mils, which is, see what this is? Well, that was disappointing. Okay, let's fish that top out. You want to do things in the fun way? This is the way to do it, eh? Luckily, that was the end of that batch, so. Alright. Mix up the ball, put this down out the way. Right, so while that's coming to the boil now, what I've got here is I've got some yeast. I'm just using a basic brewer's yeast, but you can use a lot of different yeasts, and later in the series we'll look at seeing how we can actually grow our own yeast as well. But for now, all we're going to do is we're just going to prepare this. The water's still a little bit warm for putting in the yeast, so we'll leave that for a second. So what we'll do, this is just starting to come up nicely. So I want the juice from a couple of limes in there. So you can use lemons, but you can use any citrus either. The citric acid just helps activate everything. So it doesn't matter if a seed or two drops in there, because we're going to strain all this at the end anyway. Right. One more, just for good measure. There it is. Oh, it's starting to boil nicely now. Does look good. So, with a stir. Right, now that's boiling away, we will turn that down just a little bit. Now, we're going to boil that for 5 to 10 minutes. Right, now that is simmering away really nicely there. So now I'm going to add some more water to the yeast. Just let that activate. You can just put the dry yeast straight in there, but if you add the dry yeast straight in there, sometimes it doesn't activate properly. You don't get the full use of the yeast, so I like to just get it started first. So we'll give that a few minutes to activate, and we'll let that boil for another 5 minutes or so, and then we will come back and we will move on to the next part. Okay, now our mixture's been boiling away happily for the last 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to turn that off now, and we're going to let that cool. When that cools down back to around body temperature, or as it's referred to in many of the old recipes, the temperature of blood, that's around 38 degrees C, or I think 96 Fahrenheit. then we'll strain that off and we'll add the yeast. We can't add the yeast to the boiling mixture because yeast is a living thing, and obviously that's going to kill it. So that's now sitting there resting. Our yeast is coming along nicely. I'll be able to show you what it looks like just before I put it in. It's activating beautifully. I'm watching it appear and starting to bubble away, so it's going to be really good and really active yeast. It's going to be really happy. But we need to make sure that that water is down to the right temperature. So we're going to leave that for now, let that sit for a while. That'll take a while. We're going to let it cool down naturally, and then we're going to come back and we're going to add it to the cooler water, add in the yeast, and then it's going to be just awesome. But we'll let that sit. And this thing will take, they say 16 to 24 hours. I find that makes it a little bit lively in the bottle. I like to leave it just a little bit longer than that. I tried one a couple of months ago where I left it in the bottle for in the fermenter for a week or so before I bottled it. That didn't work. All the activity went out of it. It was dead flat and it was just horrible. The first batch I made, I left it 16 hours and I bottled it. It tasted fantastic, but it was just a little bit too lively and it was really hard to open the bottles without losing most of the ginger beer. So this time we're going to leave it for probably about 40 odd hours and then we're going to bottle it. I'm only making 1 gallon, around 4 litres of it, because we're going to make these in short runs, and then we'll come back and do a taste test in a week or so when this is ready. This doesn't take long to sit, and you don't leave some of these beers sitting for too long. They don't have preservatives in them and they won't last for ages and ages. So these are beers that we're going to create that are short beers, ferment quickly, drink them quickly, usually within a 2-week cycle. Some of them are even shorter than that and we'll get to one of them later. Alright, so for now we're just going to let this cool and then we'll come back in about an hour when this is down to the right temperature or so, and then we'll add in the rest of the water and we'll add the yeast to it. So see you in a bit. Okay, welcome back. So now what we're going to do, we're going to pour that into here. Got a strainer to strain all the lumps of ginger because we don't really need them in the beer. Then I'll be adding the yeast. I don't know if you can see that in the camera, but it's coming along nicely. It's foaming up quite nicely. But I'll pour that into here. I've already got the rest of the water in here. I could have boiled all of the water in there, the 4 litres of, or the gallon of water in this one tub, which you would have done traditionally. But I don't have the issue of having water that's full of bacteria and whatnot, so I've just used some cooler water in here that I've prepared, and that can all be boiled, poured into here, and that way we'll make sure that we get, it'll help cool it down a bit quicker. So let's pour that in here, do this nice and slowly, we don't want this falling off. See those lumps coming out? Right. Now, traditionally we'd probably use a cheesecloth to strain out some of the ginger powder. I don't have one at the moment. I'll have one for the next one. So there'll be a little bit of sediment in the beer when I make it, but that's fine. It will add a stronger ginger flavour because the ginger in the beer will infuse over time. But once again, that's not really an issue for us. Now, they say you can tell by putting your hands on the side and feeling it. What I do have here is a thermometer, which I'm going to drop in there and see if that's coming close to where it needs to be. It's climbing up. Alright, that's still at around 44 degrees at the moment, 44 degrees centigrade. So we're going to leave that for a while because 44 is a bit hot for the yeast. So we're going to let that sit for a while, and then when it gets down by about another 6 or 7 degrees, then we'll come back, we'll add the yeast to it, and then basically we're going to cover that and we're going to let that sit for about 40 hours, and then it should be ready for bottling. Ideally you check it occasionally, and when it looks like it's just slowing down with the working and it's not bubbling away anymore, then it's time to bottle. So we'll see how that goes. But right now, let's just let that sit, and we'll come back. We'll come back in a couple of hours, probably half an hour or so. Right, see you in a bit. Okay, welcome back. Now, this has now cooled to 38 degrees C, about 96 or 98 body temperature basically. If you don't have a thermometer, that's fine. On my hand, that is barely warm, right? So not hot, not cold, but barely warm, right? We just need it warm enough that the yeast can feast. We don't want the yeast to be too hot. The yeast will die. Too cold, and the yeast won't activate, may not activate properly. So I don't know if you can see this. That's my yeast. It's activated beautifully and it's all foamy. So we're just going to a bit of a swish, and we're going to put that into there. Right, and now all we're going to do now is we're going to cover this, cover the cloth. We're going to let it breathe for 24 to 48 hours. Right, and that's going to sit there quite happily. Then we'll come back probably tomorrow afternoon, and we will bottle it. And once they're bottled, we put our bottles straight into the fridge. You want to slow any secondary fermentation down as much as possible. You keep it in too warm an environment, the yeast will go crazy. You can have exploding bottles. We don't want that. So what we want to do, we're going to let that cool. Traditionally, these would have been put in either earthenware jugs with a cork in them or a bung, which could have popped if needed, if the pressure got too high, or in a small cask, once again with a bung, that could pop if pressure gets too high. I'm using pop top bottles. I'll show you one when I'm bottling tomorrow. I need to make sure that I've got enough fermentation out of this so it doesn't get a bit too lively when I try and open them, because the idea is to drink them, not to watch them foam away. So we're going to leave this here. We'll come back tomorrow and we'll have a look and we'll see just what it looks like, and then we'll get it bottled, and then we'll have a drink in a couple of days' time, and we'll let you know how it's turned out. All right. See you tomorrow afternoon to get this bottled. Okay, it's been just over 30 hours. I've checked this a little while ago. It's basically stopped bubbling. It's been very calm. There's the odd bubble every now and then, so I think it's time to bottle it now. And just remember, your fermenting time is going to vary slightly depending on how hot or how cold it is. It has been unseasonably warm the last day or so here. We're in late autumn, so I'd expect it to have been cooler, so I thought it would have taken a bit longer. It hasn't. So we're going to bottle these. Now, I like to bottle these in bottles like this with the pop top. They pop the top and you clip them down. A lot easier than corking, a lot easier than crown capping, and I don't particularly like the plastic bottles with screw top. So we're going to do this nice and simply. So put that there. We've got a funnel. Now all of these have been sterilised already. Sterilising them is reasonably easy. You can boil them for 10-15 minutes, but that's quite hard to do when you've got quite a few bottles. I've got not probably 8 or 9 bottles worth here in this batch. You could use something like a baby sterilising formula. Like I tried Milton once, which is one of them, but it was it left quite a very strong antiseptic smell afterwards, which didn't really appeal to me. Did a good job though. But I went to my local brewing supplies place and asked them for something for sterilising the bottles, and they gave me a sterilising powder that I mixed with warm water, and I washed them in there, rinsed them in cold water, dry them out, and I use these. Now these rubber caps will eventually crack and dry, but the trick is as soon as you've finished pouring the bottle into a glass, you give it a good wash, and give it a good wash of this to make sure that it's clean, and they tend to last a while. These bottles I'm using today have probably been used at least half a dozen times, and there's no sign of any perishing on the rubber. So look after them and you can get a lot of uses out of them. Now there's plenty of these bottles out there on the market. Just go to your local bottle shop, pick them up. You can even go to Fates and boot sales and things like that, pick them up. I've picked up probably 30 to 40 of these bottles at the markets. I think I paid about 25 bucks for them all up. But as they're highly reusable, it makes perfect sense. So now what we're going to do, this is a new funnel and it's not going to quite work the way I want it to, so I'm going to have to grab my old funnel. All of these have been sterilised, so that's okay. I've got a bit of dust in there. Actually no, I'm going to go and sterilise this one and come back because that was too big to fit in the bottle mouth. I'm back in a couple of minutes. Right, problem solved. I didn't end up sterilising that one for now, but what I did, I had a look. This is a filler pipe from a standard brewing kit, and I had a second one of these filling nozzles which fits very nicely into the top here and jams it in place, so we're going to be using that for our filler. So it gets in the bottle so, and it takes some nice and slowly. Ideally, you'd want to strain this through a cheesecloth or something. I'm not too concerned about that because I'm not too worried about the sediment in the bottom of the bottles. I tend to pour the bottle and just leave that little bit of sediment in anyway. A little bit of additional yeast in this thing while it's bottle fermenting is probably a good thing. Right. Just putting this in that little tub because that's all been cleaned as well. Everything I'm using has been sterilised before we started. Let's balance that in there. So, lid on, contain it, put our bottle there, put that out of the way. When you get the next one, we'll do one more of these. Right, so I'm just dipping this into this thing just to the top and just letting it run in slowly. So it takes a little bit longer to do, but you stir up less of it and you get less of the junk in the bottom. And as I'm only doing 8 or 9 bottles, it really doesn't take that long. I tell you now, this stuff smells amazing. Alright. Now another thing when you bottle these, make sure you leave some room in the bottle. I'm only filling the bottles up to here. Alright, we want to leave some room in the bottle because what we want to make sure is that we have some room for any gas in there to expand. I don't want the gas to have nowhere to go and to blow the bottle up. So Just want to fill up that much. So I'm only filling the bottles up to about here. And they'll go in the fridge when they're done. Okay? Okay, well that has given us 8 bottles. There's probably about another bottle's worth in here. But it's got all the sediment at the bottom. But don't worry, that's not going to waste. This will be going into my wife's worm farm. Apparently they absolutely love the yeast, so that's going to keep them happy. That'll provide some good fertiliser for her gardens. And I'm going to put these straight in the fridge, and I'm going to leave these for up to a week. I will probably try one of these towards the end of the week, and I will let you know how it goes. Just remember, straight in the fridge. You want to slow down any secondary fermentation. You don't want those bottles to pop. If you're in a really cold climate, then maybe just put them in the garage. Our days are still fairly warm here, so I don't want these things getting a bit carried away. And once they're done, they'll probably last for a week or two quite easily. Sometimes up to a month or so, depends on how clean everything was when you prepared it. We're not using any preservatives or anything like that as they would do in commercial endeavours. Always when you're doing things from home, as much as you want to sterilise things, you're going to get, nothing's perfect. So these should actually last, but they still should last quite well. Older beers, they were brewed quickly and they were drunk fairly quickly. So that's all we have for now. We'll talk a bit more about brewing techniques and how these things went as the series goes on. But for now, I'll see you later when it's time to taste test these, and we'll let you know what it's like. No worries. See you soon.